Well, I'm Randal Rauser, Director of Faith-Based Organization Investigations with Veritas Solutions, and today I'm delighted to be joined with Bob Stenhouse, the CEO of Veritas Solutions, and we're going to be talking about investigations and the church. So, Bob, great to have you with us.
Great. Thanks so much, Randal. We've talked so much about this informally, and I think it's just really exciting to be able to share our experiences and our consulting services formally for, there's a lot of need for this type of work in the churches, as we know. And so I'm really happy that we were able to do our part.
Indeed, there is a lot of need for it. I mean, it seems like every day there's a new scandal in the headlines relating to the church. And you and I both know that for every scandal that makes the headlines of the newspaper, there are hundreds, if not thousands, that do not. There's a real problem within the church, and I suspect there always has been, of abuse. And so it's important for us to address it more directly.
Absolutely. And we just have to we don't sugarcoat things. We just look at it, what it is. Interestingly, you talk about the scandals, and the scandals we read about are usually related to sexual misconduct. But we also know there's other types of abuses that go on the church daily that are not going to make the news because they're not sexual in nature, whether that be bullying, whether that be spiritual abuse, harassment, discrimination. There's other types of things that are going on that aren't as sensational as the sexual misconduct, but can be just as impactful on the people that are the recipients of that type of behavior.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people, that from what you just said, harassment to bullying, for example, they may not even realize that they are experiencing abuse when they are. They may have a narcissistic leader, a bully, and they've never realized that what they are experiencing is abuse.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
So a lot of churches, of course, they have already in advance plans to deal with crises. Like in case of fire, what do? They've got fire doors, they've got escape routes, they've got a plan to call a fire department, they've got the insurance. But when it comes to issues like abuse, many churches are not prepared to address issues of abuse. So I want to explore with you, what do churches do when they become aware of allegations of abuse? So why don't we begin by saying church becomes aware that there is an allegation. How do they begin to assess the risk posed by the allegation and to decide how they should proceed to address it?
Yeah. First and foremost, what I always suggest to all of our clients, and it's going to apply to churches as well, is that we have to begin with a risk lens, and that risk lens should be if true. Because if we're not beginning with that lens, then we're going to open up to all kinds of speculation, biases, loyalties. Jim would never do that. We're going to be open to all kinds of noise surrounding the issue that oftentimes can bog down the organization. And so in terms of addressing issues, allegations of misconduct, particularly the high-risk ones, when I say high risk, generally the sexual misconduct ones are going to be your higher risk. And begin with an if true lens, and it will help churches, faith-based organizations, quasi-church organizations, mission organizations, et cetera, be able to start on the foundation of doing the right thing based on, if this is true, what should we do?
Okay, let's consider a couple scenarios. So one scenario, allegation comes forward that a pastor shouted at the administrative assistant and called her an idiot because she, messed up some photocopying or something. Second scenario, allegation comes forward that the youth pastor is engaging in what could be grooming behavior and potentially sexually touched one of the youth. Two different scenarios there. How do you assess the risk in each one of those two scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So what organizations, churches need to understand is both, by definition of the law, as related to harassment, bullying, sexual harassment, discrimination, both are actually in breach of legislation. Churches are also employers. Employers are required to abide by the standards set out in occupational health and safety legislation, human rights legislation, et cetera, et cetera. In the first instance, that would fall within the definition of harassment. Okay. And the definition is that someone should know or ought reasonably to have known that by calling someone an idiot, it would cause offense or humiliation. And that's generally the legislation from across Canada. So, from a technical breach of legislation, which also should be mirrored in policy, that would actually be called harassing behavior. Now, is the pastor going to get terminated for that? Probably not. But the pastor should be held accountable, right? Second scenario. Now we have the interesting part about grooming behavior, and I think it's important for the audience to know that grooming behavior is not necessarily an offense in itself. It could be extra attention. It could be getting alone with somebody. It could be breaching some standards or agreements with respect to interaction of persons where there's a power differential, et cetera, et cetera. But the grooming behavior in itself, we've had cases, Randal, I believe that you did one of the investigations where the parents thought there was grooming behavior towards someone in a faith-based organization. You reviewed it and said, no, this would not fall within the reasonable definitions or understanding of grooming behavior. So it's important that we don't get over paranoid about people providing care versus not be naive about potential grooming behavior. And that's where we need discernment. Frankly, we'll use terminology we're all familiar with. We need leadership discernment on these issues. We cannot be naive, nor can we be cynical. On the second scenario, what I would do there is I would gather as much information as I could to fully understand what might be going on before I might make a decision to launch a formal investigation or keep people safe and place someone on administrative leave.
I would say that that preliminary assessment is there's a sufficient level of seriousness that an investigation is warranted. One of the next questions is, well, do you go internal and handle it with the internal resources of the organization, the church, and so on? Or do you go external to a firm, for example, such as Veritas Solutions? And how do you make a discernment as an organization whether you should go internal or external for the investigation?
I think there's a number of factors that contribute to that, whether it be our church and faith-based client base or whether it be our employee base, that I say the same things, is that the higher the risk and complexity, that likely internally you don't have the expertise to be able to manage and deal with it so that you have a legally defensible outcome, whichever way that goes. And so we investigate to the standard of a legally defensible outcome. We could come to an outcome where it did not happen, and we find in favor of the respondent of an allegation. It could come to an outcome where we believe on the balance of probabilities it did happen, and therefore the church needs to engage in certain risk mitigation strategies, including potentially termination of employment. So it really is about risk. It's about understanding one's own capacity. I have seen cases, Randal, you and I have talked about them, where it says, well, we had an elder investigate this, or we had a deacon investigate this. And the first thing that comes to my mind is, what are their qualifications to investigate? Are they trained in investigations? Do they understand interviewing techniques? Are they trauma informed? Do they understand the law? Do they even know what balance of probabilities is? And usually the answer to all those things is no. So you have people that are not competent to investigate something very serious that could end up as a lawsuit, could end up in the news, and we're seeing more and more and more of this, of course, of cases ending up in the news. And so I think churches need to be wise, and they need to make sure that they understand that investigations, particularly for high-risk cases, is not for the amateurs.
Could you also address another issue, that of optics? You said justice must not only be done, it must be seen to be done. And now you could have an internal investigator who has the skill set, but is there still not a risk in terms of the optics of handling certain allegations internally versus externally?
Absolutely. You've got the optics of justice. You also have something called the apprehension of bias, a reasonable apprehension of bias. In church organizations, as we know, maybe it's schools, maybe it's Christian schools or universities or whatever, it's a very small community. And relationships are such a big part of the faith walk of Christians that you have these relationships intertwined. And by virtue of that alone, it's going to be very difficult to overcome what's called the apprehension of bias, or the fact that justice does not appear to have been done. And that could be board members towards the pastor, that could be a pastor towards a youth pastor, that could be a deacon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Churches, as we know, they're filled with sinners just like us. And you have egos get involved, you have, power struggles, and all of these things, as we know, Randal, happen in the church. And so, again, high risk cases being mitigated internally just by virtue of the relationships, in my view, raise a reasonable apprehension of bias. We've seen it scandal after scandal after scandal after scandal. When people are entrusted to deal with the issue, but it's discovered that they have close personal relationships, or they have these interpersonal dynamics that raise this apprehension of bias.
Well said. Now, you used a term earlier, respondent, and that's important. I think we should say something about the terminology of complainant and respondent versus language such as victim and abuser or what have you. So could you say something about how it is important that we use the appropriate language when doing an objective and fair investigation?
Yeah, absolutely. Randal, as an example, as you know, and maybe your audience doesn't know, I'm a former police officer. And so our wording in the criminal domain would have been victim and accused. Okay. We hear victim survivor, we hear perpetrator, we hear all of this language that within a certain context is appropriate, proper, applicable. However, in a workplace investigation or in an impartial, unbiased investigation, we strive to use impartial type of language. So a complainant is just someone that's brought forward the allegations. A respondent is someone that has an opportunity to respond. There's no assumption of guilt going into the investigation. We have to remain impartial. We gather all evidence, we weigh evidence, and we come to a finding on the balance of probabilities. Using neutral terminology is part of our procedural fairness and the standards that we apply our investigations.
I'd like to add to what you've just said as well, that it's really important that the investigator not be viewed as an advocate for victim survivors of abuse, because that would be to blur the roles, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, it's not that in my own heart that I might not advocate for somebody, right? I mean, I advocate for justice and truth, as do you. If justice and truth means that someone has been harmed, in my own heart and mind, I want to do my part to make sure that justice is done. Okay. So it doesn't mean that we don't have compassion or a heart towards somebody. It just means that we are not in the advocacy realm. As you know, we do some advocacy within Veritas Solutions within a very select criteria. We will take on some advocacy cases, but it's very different from what we do for our clients that require specific impartiality and procedural fairness.
You mentioned that within police or criminal investigations, you've got this different language. You've got accused, for example, and you've got victim. Now, another thing that's very important is the difference of the evidential standards in a criminal versus a workplace investigation. Could you say a word about that?
Absolutely. And it's so interesting how so many people get this wrong. I just finished my 3-day workplace investigations training yesterday, and about half of the participants believed that if someone is found not guilty in criminal court, that it has impact on decisions that are made within the workplace or the church or the school or whatever. And it does not. It's a very different standard. I use maybe a little bit dated, but I use the story of O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson was found not guilty in criminal court. O.J. Simpson was found civilly liable for murder in civil court. The reason being, it's a different standard of proof. High standard in criminal court is called beyond a reasonable doubt. A lower standard within the civil realm, which is what we would be talking about in any other type of administrative investigations, is called the balance of probabilities. What is more likely than not to have occurred? And as you know, Randal, you've done well over 100 investigations, that you come to findings on the balance of probabilities based on who you believe on a proper credibility assessment. And so that means that even in the church, on a he said, she said complaint, which some people weaponize that terminology and saying, well, it's a he said, she said, we don't know. That's not okay. He said, she said just means that someone said something happened, someone denies it happened. And in terms of not only legal due diligence, but I would argue moral and spiritual due diligence, is that leaders of churches, faith-based organizations need to be focused on finding the truth based on this particular balance of probabilities and make the appropriate decisions coming from there.
Want to dive into the anatomy of an investigation in a moment, including what you've already anticipated, which is credibility assessments as an essential key to it. But first, I just want to underscore one more thing with respect to criminal versus workplace. Let's say that, so this allegations come forward within a church, and it's of such a sufficiently egregious nature as an allegation that the police have launched a criminal investigation. Does the fact that the police have launched a criminal investigation now mean that the church doesn't have to worry about putting a workplace investigatory lens upon the allegation?
Not at all. In fact, it should not influence. What should happen, again, if you use the professionals to assist, is that we will contact the police. We will liaise with them. We will say, look, we are doing this for the due diligence, fiduciary responsibility, duty of care, as enshrined in legislation, to be able to figure out what to do here. And so a parallel investigation by the police, unless they say, look, we would prefer you not talk to these people because it could taint witness evidence. And even then we may have discussions, because as a former police officer, I can tell you is that they're looking at it from what's called the reasonable likelihood of conviction. And a reasonable likelihood of conviction will even dictate whether or not they investigate, or whether or not they put the time, energy, and effort into a criminal investigation when it's not likely that there's going to be a criminal conviction. And then it goes to the Crown Prosecutor that's weighing it out through that lens as well. Is there a reasonable likelihood of conviction? And they may choose to drop the case. So now all of a sudden, a year later, you have a criminal case that they dropped the charges, and the church, school, faith-based organization is now left to say, now what do we do? You've got a year later where people's memories have faded. You've got you have a duty to protect people within your organization. You have a duty to ensure that people are not at risk. And if you put all your eggs in the criminal justice basket, I can tell you, being in the criminal justice system, you're likely to be disappointed.
Okay, so let's say we have an external investigation launched into this serious complaint. What can you give us a flyover? What would the key components of the investigation as done by a firm like Veritas Solutions look like?
Mm-hmm. Randal, as you know, in my courses, I teach what I call the anatomy of an investigation. I've got 6 critical components. We have investigators, high risk, very complex, 30, 40, 50 interview types of cases, all the way down to very low risk, 2 or 3 interviews and come to a finding. The anatomy is the same. You have an initiating event. And as we've seen in recent cases that have been in the news, the initiating event was a social media campaign. And that's becoming more prevalent. We've had several cases now where the initiating event, making allegations, is external and it comes out of social media. The organization still has a duty of care. They cannot unsee what they've seen. They cannot unhear what they've heard. So they choose to accept the initiating event, launch into an investigation. You identify your parties, who's involved, who is it alleged is engaged in misconduct? Have we put the sufficient checks and balances on safety, checks and balances on psychological safety in place if we have a case where, if true, someone is at risk? You have your respondent, you have potential complainants, maybe they're anonymous for now, maybe you're going to be able to flesh out the anonymity to be able to actually start the investigation. You have to identify the parties. Who has been harmed, who is alleged to have caused harm, who are potential witnesses. From there, you begin to your interviews of people. Hopefully, they're going to be cooperative in their interviews. They're going to give you information. We're going to test the information. We're going to be starting to test credibility. We're going to start to then gather all evidence, right? Not just interviews. It could be text messages, it could be emails, it could be photographs, whatever it might be. The investigator needs to gather evidence. Okay. The next component, number 4, is now analyzing the evidence and weighing the evidence. We place weight on evidence. We have a direct set of text messages, WhatsApp messages, whatever it is, people are communicating, social media, whatever method of communication that we may look as evidence of this is actually, we place a lot of weight on it. Some evidence we might not place a lot of weight on it. We're deciding whether we place weight on testimony. We're establishing credibility. We're now starting to narrow down to our probabilities. I always say keep an open mind to all possibilities, but narrow down to probabilities based on the evidence. Okay, so we're now analyzing. Then we come to a finding. Based on this analysis, we find that the behavior did occur. We have our 2-pronged test we apply. On the balance of probabilities, the behavior as reported did occur. And then we take it to the next level, the next test. If we find it did occur, then we establish whether or not that is in breach of policy, legislation, law, codes of conduct, whatever it is governing behavior that we're required to be compliant to, right? So the 2-pronged test, because sometimes we'll come to a finding that, yes, it happened, but we don't believe that it breached any of these types of scenarios. And I go back to your alleged grooming case where there was what was alleged to have occurred did occur, right? Someone dressed up as someone as Halloween. Maybe someone thought that was offensive or grooming behavior, and you're looking at saying it's just someone dressing up as someone at Halloween. So yes, it happened, but it did not meet what we would establish as the criteria to meet a sexual grooming or sexual harassment case. And so that's our findings. We have a finding of founded, unfounded, or we could not substantiate. Rarely do we get to a could not substantiate, because oftentimes that's a catch-all for people that don't know how to investigate and say, oh, we don't know. She said it happened. He said it didn't. We don't know, so we can't do anything. Which, in the words of one judge, is a denial of justice. So we come to a finding, and then the next step is now what? Right? The 6 components. That's our discipline sanction. What do we do now? Do we terminate employment? Do we part ways with people? Do we make it right for the complainant, who is now, we could arguably say, is a victim of abuse? Because we only can only come to that if we come to a founded allegation. So I have no problem now transitioning to say our complainant is actually a victim of abuse. And so organizations need to make the victims of abuse right. They need to make them whole. What might that look like? It could be financial. It could be a public apology. Whatever it is, organizations miss this step, is making the victim of any sort of abuse whole. And I think that that's putting themselves at great risk. And we can anticipate that more of these cases will be hitting the news, will be hitting social media. There will be a spotlight the more and more people are aware.
To come back to the one piece there of the credibility assessment, and to say a little bit more about it, and let's come back to one of these scenarios. So it was the administrative assistant has a complaint that the pastor shouted at her and called her an idiot. He says it just didn't happen. What would be the kinds of factors that you would take into consideration analyzing those two very different he said, she said accounts of what happened in the photocopy room? What would be the things you'd look for that would allow you to come to a finding in favor of the complainant or the respondent in that case?
Right, absolutely. And so we always begin an investigation with all possibilities. Is it true? Did it happen? Right. That's where I suggest you start, but you need to be open to the possibility. Maybe it isn't true. Maybe there's a grudge or a motive to bring forth a false allegation. So, as you know, one of our 12 factors that we use in credibility assessments, the one that we put a lot of weight on is motive. Is there a motive to falsify? Is there a motive to deny? Is there a motive to minimize? Or is there a motive to exaggerate? On the complainant side, if the motive is, I want to destroy someone's career or life, that's possible. We've seen that happen. Doesn't happen often, very rare, but it could. On the respondent side, so the pastor respondent. By the way, I would suggest that the pastor is probably not going to say it didn't happen. The pastor is probably going to do what we call a soft denial and say something on the lines of, I don't believe that I ever said that. So I don't believe I said that. I don't remember saying that. I don't recall that. Those are all what we call soft denials, as opposed to absolutely not. I don't speak like that. I would never make that type of insult towards anybody, even if I am frustrated. Very different answer, right? So we have to decide who's telling the truth. We have 12 factors. Of the 12, motive is a big one. Any corroborating evidence is a big one. And the nuanced analysis. You and I both like that factor because we're going to be able to flesh out nuance in our interview. So as an example with the pastor, we might say, well, if you're saying it didn't happen, why do you think she says it did? And listen carefully, right? And so the better we get at credibility assessments, the more we're going to be able to come to a finding on the balance of probabilities. However, you and I both know, Randall, that this is an advanced technique for anyone involved in investigations. And many folks, even some folks that are professional investigators, actually don't go to that level of detailed analysis on credibility.
Just like to say a little bit about corroboration. So, for example, you could have maybe there's video surveillance, and maybe let's say it doesn't catch the audio, but it can catch what appears to be the pastor looking very angry and having a raised voice toward the administrative assistant in the video shot. That could be evidence. Or another pastor maybe overheard him shouting. That could be evidence. How about this one? Confidant witness. So let's say that right after the event allegedly happens, the administrative assistant calls a friend in tears and her friend reports that he relayed that he shouted at me. Could that be evidence as well?
Absolutely. So, so what that's called in the courts is evidence on first telling. We also refer to it as confidant witnesses. So even though it's hearsay because the witness did not see it, the witness did not observe it, what they are attesting to is the way that the complainant presented it to them. So if it happens within, a short period of time that they text someone or they call someone and they say, you won't believe what just happened. I'm in tears. I can't believe that this guy on Sunday morning can talk about love and grace and on Thursday afternoon can call me an idiot. Usually people have people that they take into their confidence. That is evidence that not only can be used, it should be used because it goes to the allegation of the credibility of the person that's brought it forward.
Great. So now we have this ongoing investigation. One of the big questions as well, I think, for churches or other organizations is the communication piece. People are going to talk, whether you like it or not, even if, as you know, we tell witnesses, maintain confidentiality, do not talk with other people about this. People talk. Some of them are maybe part of the investigation. Some just have some vague awareness that something is going on. How should an organization deal with the issue, very messy issue sometimes, of communicating both internally to the organization and to the wider constituency or community about what may be going on in terms of an investigation?
Well, and it's so interesting. I'm going to kind of just unpack it from a number of different areas here, Randall. As you know, growing up in the church yourself, the church is rife with gossip, right? Gossip seems to be one of those sins that no one's all that worried about. They're worried about what someone's wearing to church on a Sunday morning, but they're not worried about all the gossip going on at the tea afterwards, right? So we've got the gossip perspective that we have to manage. You've got the optics. You've got alliances and allegiances. You've got blind loyalties. You've got so many of these factors. I'm reminded by, and we're only aware of the issue with the Meeting House Church out of Ontario. As you and I both, we're both quite familiar with the pastoral team and the former head pastor. And I'm reminded of that level of complexity and loyalties and blind loyalties and perhaps cultic type of personality. Who knows? I don't know, but I've seen it. You've seen cult of personality in church at play. I've seen it firsthand, cult of personality in church at play. And so what do you do? In terms of church, I am always the person that is always, whether it be in church or not, I've been involved in investigations for 40 plus years in a whole number of different environments. And I am a person that believes in transparency as much as possible, right? So be transparent. Don't hide behind sugar-coated words, right? There's been an allegation of inappropriate behavior. That just leaves everything to everyone's imagination. You know that that's one of my pet words that I don't like, right? Define inappropriate. Could it be everything from I made a comment that someone looked pretty today, or could it be all the way up to the extent where someone was physically touching somebody or grooming them or sending explicit text messages? We don't know. So if we use the word inappropriate, you just leave it open to imagination, you leave it open to gossip, and I think more harm is caused than being very clear, transparent, just say what it is, what you're doing, how you're doing it, because trust is going to be broken either way. And it is imperative, and I think even more so in faith-based organizations, to restore trust. And you cannot restore trust when things are hidden, when things are swept under the carpet, or when things are presented through a lens of a euphemism, or we don't want to really what it said, right? I remember years ago in the situation I was involved in, and a senior church leader at a seminary was aware of the issue. And so he used the term, was it a moral failing? Well, in my view, that's just as ambiguous as inappropriate. What's a moral failing, right? Maybe a moral failing was someone looked lustfully at somebody. Could that be a moral failing? I don't know. Or is it an affair? Or is it a extramarital affairs or multiple affairs or grooming behavior or potential sexual predator behavior? So broad. I say transparency, yet you also have to balance confidentiality. But it is a sensitive balance, but err on the side of transparency. People are not dumb. People are not stupid. Put a kind of a blanket over the possibility for gossip and other things to happen.
It's been very helpful. I think it's been a great conversation, and hopefully this has given churches some new ways to begin to prepare for what to do in case of abuse, just like you would be prepared for what to do in case of fire. Now, as we wrap up, do you have any final words of wisdom or encouragement or direction or anything else that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I mean, I think I'll leave the theological component to all of this to you, Randal. And I'll just say this is that, having, walked the line within church and outside of church and seen a lot of things in my life, more than any other person should ever see. All I can say is this, is that when a light is shone on darkness, which I believe is what we are called to be the salt and the light. And so when it's shone on the dark parts of an organization, institution, that is not about airing their dirty laundry or making the church look bad or the school look bad or being worried. That's doing the right thing, right? Truth matters, justice matters to God, as far as my understanding of the God of the Bible. Truth and justice is a major component done within grace and love, absolutely. But truth and justice is just as high up there in terms of priorities. And I think that churches should sometimes be focusing on that truth and justice part if they really want to be the salt and the light of the world.
Absolutely. Jesus also, of course, described the church itself. He described himself as light. We are called to be people of light, and we are called to be people of truth. And how can you be those things if you're allowing darkness to fester, or if you're engaging in cover-ups of it? So I think this kind of what you're speaking today, this is kingdom work. Amen.
Yeah, absolutely. You and I've talked about that a lot, and you're leading the charge. I'm only behind the scenes putting the context of many years of investigations and doing the right thing. But in terms of this particular branch, what we're doing and how we're helping churches get this right, you're the director, and churches are going to be in good hands when they reach out to you.
Well, I'm happy to agree with that. Thanks a lot for joining us, Bob. It's been a great conversation.